For Catholics who accept this proposal, the debate over papal infallibility no longer hinges on whether the doctrine can be found in Scripture or the early church. This is the same issue that we run into all the time that I keep pointing out is, Rome continues to argue for its positions, and Newman certainly does, from history and from Scripture, but ultimately the dogma doesn't depend on either of those things. And so theoretically, you can kind of throw out Scripture, you can throw out tradition, and say, okay, maybe Protestants have better arguments in both of those things, but it doesn't really matter. Because ultimately, if the magisterium says something is true, then it is true, because that is the instrument that God has chosen to use to preserve the truths of both Scripture and tradition and to interpret both Scripture and tradition. It just does that within a Roman Catholic perspective. And so even though he differs so heavily from Manning in his methodology and his approach to the early church, I think Newman really does come to exactly the same place that Manning does, in that the magisterium becomes its own justification for itself. Because both of them ultimately end up in the same place. Both of them ultimately end up saying that you really can't determine the dogma of the papacy by either history or Scripture, and that it is ultimately the papacy, or the magisterium, that determines how those two things are to be understood. Therefore, we believe in the authority of the papacy because the Pope says so. I think you end up there in Newman. And I know that you're going to tell me that I'm being too simplistic, and that's not the case, but I really think that they both end up in the same place. You can't avoid that. And so I know people scoff at James White's constant sola ecclesia thing, but he's right. He's just right. He's right. It does end up there. You do end up just trusting the authority of the church without any of the other things. Those really only become kind of tradition, and Scripture can become supporting arguments for your claims, but your claims ultimately really just depend on what the magisterium says. Because if you've submitted to the magisterium to have that kind of interpretive authority, that is your authority. So you're not going to contradict the magisterium with Scripture or tradition. So therefore, that does become really your kind of sole primary authority. Everything really does go back to that. All right. And so what Newman has done here, it's a pretty masterful move. It's a very smart move to make, because what he's done is rendered nearly all Reformation polemics useless in critiquing Rome, since he's basically conceded all of their claims. He has, so he can kind of concede. He can look at Chemnitz and be like, yeah, he's right. Chemnitz's examination of the Council of Trent, yeah, he was right about how he read the church, but it doesn't matter. And so it's a smart thing to do, because if you're trying to convince people of Roman claims, which Newman is, it's such an easy way to just say, therefore, just set aside all the arguments, because those don't mean anything. Set aside tradition, because they can't really understand tradition in the first place anyway. Okay. In Newman, you find, and this is a move in Roman Catholic apologetics, Newman and on, is that there is a move away from this kind of clear, scholastic, syllogistic, and straightforward reasoning that shows up when you're dealing with Protestants. So when you look at somebody like Robert Bellarmine, and Bellarmine's brilliant, right? And I think he's very wrong, but he's a brilliant guy, and I don't like probably how harshly he'd think about me for not being in Rome. But what I like about reading Bellarmine is he's just straightforward, and he says, here's my argument, here's my proposition, here is how I'm going to defend it, and here is how I respond to the refutation. It's how scholastics do theology. It's great. And so I can look at Bellarmine, like Gerhard looks at Bellarmine. He's like, all right, Bellarmine defends his proposition with, this father says this Scripture says this. And Gerhard says, all right, I'm going to respond. What does this father say? You're wrong about interpreting the father. You're wrong about interpreting the Scripture. Here's why. The guy that's like Bellarmine, someone else who's going to respond, is going to go to Gerhard, do the same thing. You have clear propositions, clear methodologies, clear sources of what's right, what's wrong, and you can have a clear debate. Once that's gone, with Newman, you can't really have that anymore, because there isn't really a clear standard of what proposition are you making and then what sources are you using to defend that proposition. It becomes a lot more slippery. And that remains with us today. That still is very much the method of Roman apologetics for the most part.